Today's episode is brought to you by Create Engage, the digital marketing agency for the disruptive management consultancy. Digital marketing has moved forwards, but most consulting firms haven't. Many consulting firms still see their corporate blog as their sole digital marketing channel and find themselves frustrated when these blogs yield little, if any, results. For those consultancies that understand digital marketing, though, it can be a huge asset and help them achieve rapid business growth. In fact, at Create Engage, we've recently written a case study of one successful consulting firm that used digital marketing to help them grow over 400% in just 3 years. Having spent countless hours researching consulting firms and consulting leaders for this podcast, it became very clear that while some firms do digital marketing well, the vast majority of consulting firms struggle to leverage its power and don't know where to start. To help those of you who want to harness the power of digital marketing to grow your consulting business, but don't have the knowledge, capacity, or in-house capability to do so, I launched Create Engage, the first digital marketing agency for the management consulting industry. As former consultants ourselves, we understand the challenges that you face when it comes to delivering effective digital marketing that engages prospective clients and generates leads. Having worked in the industry, we understand consulting buyers, what resonates with them and what doesn't. This enables us to harness the latest in digital marketing in a way that aligns with your brand and your market positioning to attract the prospective clients that you're looking to target. We understand that each consultancy is unique and have a range of services to help you shape, implement, and sustain effective digital marketing strategies that deliver results, regardless of where you are on your digital marketing journey. If you would like to find out more about how Create Engage can help you use digital marketing to take your business to the next level, then send me an email at nick@createengage.co.uk or go to our website, createengage.co.uk, where you can download that free case study that breaks down the digital marketing strategies used by one successful consulting firm to help them grow over 400% in just 3 years and gives you the secrets they used so that you can apply them in your own firm. If you want to outpace your competitors and stand out in the crowded consulting market, then get in touch. We'd love to help you grow your business through digital marketing. Hi, and welcome to Climate Consulting. In today's episode, I speak to Ian Price, the leading sales expert, performance psychologist, and author. Ian is a CEO turned business psychologist, specialising in helping organisations both develop effective sales processes and build the mental toughness needed to achieve them. Having previously worked in consulting and in a number of executive roles across telecoms and tech, Ian has become an expert in selling and business development, specialising in helping professional services businesses improve their own sales capability. This is an episode that I've wanted to do for such a long time. Sales is so often seen as a dirty word in consulting, but ultimately it's a key skill for anyone who has ambitions of making it to partner. In the increasingly competitive world that we now work in, the ability to sell is essential for success. However, sales can often be seen as an intimidating task for consultants. I get it. I've been there. I know the challenges that I'm sure you're facing if you're listening to this now. So for me, it was great to be able to bring Ian onto the show and get that professional take and hear his perspective to help hopefully take away that fear and provide a refreshing approach to selling. During this conversation, we discuss a whole host of topics directly related to how you can improve your own and your firm's sales capability. We discuss the difference between zero-sum and positive-sum selling and how it can really help you overcome your fear of actually going to sell to clients. Ian's practical advice for building an effective lead pipeline, something that I know so many of you have asked me about informally, even from a standing start, even if you have no leads or no current conversations that are ongoing. And finally, the process and systems that you can use to help supercharge your selling, whether you're running a whole firm, running a practice, or you are just trying to sell more business yourself. It was great to meet Ian and hear his thought-provoking views on how best to approach the often daunting task of selling. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode and that Ian's advice will encourage you to develop your own effective sales process to boost your business development pipeline and ultimately help you grow your career. So with all that said, sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Ian Price. Hi, Ian. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Nick. Great to be here. Thank you.
So I think today's conversation is one that I've been dying to have really since I launched the podcast. And I did do my own episode, which is probably nowhere near as good and has nowhere near the advice we're going to cover today. But what we're talking about, obviously, is selling and sales and helping consultants sell. Because I think, we've spoken before the show about how big a challenge it is, and we'll dive into it throughout today's interview. But before we get onto the topic, because we've got a good hour or so and we can talk for all of that, and I'm really keen to about selling. But actually, it'd be great to start with, for my listeners who maybe don't know you so well, just a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a performance psychologist. I kind of relate myself a little bit to the help that elite athletes get from psychologists on their performance. It's now increasingly recognized that in business, people need help with particularly mental toughness, which is my specialism, help with resilience when things get tough, help with motivation, help with personal growth, and with the ability to persist with cognitive performance. All of these are dimensions of mental toughness, and the application is particularly acute, I think, in sales and in selling. I've come to that from rather a distant, circuitous route, if you like, because I actually started out when I left university donkeys years ago in strategy consulting. So I became what they then called a research associate in LEK in the late 1980s, in the boom years. And those were heady times for consulting, because it was, quite a new thing to have teams of analysts sort of churning out graphs and spreadsheets and stuff and doing acquisition studies. And it got me very interested in the psychology of work. So I had a little itch start there, which I didn't do anything about for another 20 years or so. What happened was I went into industry, into telecoms, spent a couple of decades, a lot of that time in marketing roles supporting sales teams. So I got interested in selling at that point. And then I did a couple of CEO roles for startups in telecoms and payments companies. In 2010, I changed career, having completed a 2-year master's in organizational behavior at Birkbeck, and then started consulting as a performance psychologist, and quickly became a specialist in mental toughness, and started to get asked to do some work with sales teams. Initially, what I would call industrial sales teams, by which I mean people selling financial services, products, software, what have you, rather than consulting. The consulting came a bit later, and I can come to the differences between the two, which are fewer than you might think. So now I spend quite a lot of my time with industrial sales teams, quite a lot of time with consulting firms that want to get better at the sales part of what they do. But I also use mental toughness in different contexts, such as customer-facing teams that get a lot of pressure from external customers, and life can be tough. So I'm not at the sort of well-being, mental health end of things. I'm much more in the helping people flourish and perform at their best and at their peak.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a fantastic intro to get us right into the topic. And I think the thing for today, because there's so much in there, I want to pick up on what mental toughness means to you and to your clients, and how that plays out. Because I really do like the analogy you make around the sports side, and how that high-performing athletes have performance psychologists and everything you spoke about, and actually how they're feeding into business. It also helps that actually, when it comes to metaphors, I can barely do any, but sports is about the only thing I can make a passable metaphor in. So it's great that we've got a common language there. But I guess, and this might be a nice way to sort of ease into that conversation about almost why you need mental toughness. And you mentioned that you work with consulting firms around this sales piece. Because I think the first thing, before we even dive into how to improve sales and how you can build that resilience to keep knocking on doors when people say no, is almost, what is it that you find sort of those first hang-ups when you're speaking to consultants? So what I mean is, from my time when I was in the industry, there were people who you'd meet who, frankly, I think selling has a very bad reputation in our industry. And to the point where, as almost a badge of honor, some consultants would call themselves delivery people. So I'm not a grubby salesperson. I'm a delivery consultant. And actually, maybe we start there of almost, when you're working with consulting clients, what are some of those challenges you hear, and almost how do you start to help people overcome and break down those barriers so they can even start to think about sales?
You're absolutely right about sales having a bad reputation. I think it has a bad reputation, full stop, and sometimes deservedly so. And one of the first barriers that I confront very commonly is that people have a lot of baggage around sales. So when consultants, particularly if they're looking to progress in their organization, are told you need to start becoming quite good at selling, one of the main inhibitors is the negativity with which they regard sales. And an exercise I'll often do in a workshop situation is say to people, step outside your day job, think about your life outside work, grab a post-it, write down the first 3 words that come to your mind when you think about sales or selling. And this was an exercise Dan Pink did when he was researching his book, To Sell is Human, which kind of preempts further reading on the subject. But what tends to happen, you put these post-its up on the wall, the sorts of words that come up are pushy, sleazy, used car salesman, double glazing, yuck, those sorts of words. And then I ask the question, do you think that this bleeds into how you think about sales at work? Does it inhibit the way we think about sales and the doing of sales? And of course it does. I've thought deeply about why that happens. And when you look at sales over the years, going back to sort of the post-war period in the West, it was boom time. It was the era of mass property ownership and wealth, and of course people were flogging all sorts of stuff in a sort of fairly remorseless fashion, and unfortunately that reputation has stuck. But that sort of selling has kind of died away. It's almost completely dead, particularly in a business-to-business context. But
it's the sort of encyclopedia selling that you hear about in books of old.
Yeah, it doesn't really happen anymore. But the reputation is still there, and in all the tropes that we have from films, Glengarry Glen Ross, Wolf of Wall Street, they're all from a certain type of selling. So what I say to people is we need to kind of put that view of selling where it belongs in the past. Unfortunately, it still has echoes in the way industrial salespeople are trained, but that's another thing altogether. But I say to people, let's just use very, very simple game theory to distinguish that historic form of selling from what you are doing today. And the way I do this, I say, you can think of that old-fashioned, sleazy, pushy selling as zero-sum selling, very transactional. Mm-hmm. I am just trying to get something from you, money, and I'm not too bothered about whether you actually need the product that I've got, whether it's going to enrich you or whether it's going to add value in any sort of way. So that's pretty much a zero-sum transaction. When I talk to people in consulting firms about what they sell, is there value added? Is the pie bigger from having worked together, from having delivered some sort of consulting piece of work? Well, of course it is. So it's positive sum. It isn't zero sum, it's positive sum. And when I get people to think of those two things in completely different ways, it becomes much more liberating for them, because if you're positive sum selling, what you're trying to do is establish a fit. You're not doing something sleazy. You're not doing something where you're manipulating the customer to buying something that has no value to them. You're trying to establish a situation where there's a mutual benefit. Clearly, you'll be getting a nice fee, but they'll be getting something of value above and beyond the fee that you're deriving for the service. Now, does zero-sum selling exist in the consulting world? Well, there are examples from time to time, and people will occasionally point me to firms where they have witnessed it. But when I'm working with, consulting firms, they're very quick and ready to admit, actually, it's not zero-sum at all. It's very much positive sum. And then you can start to think about sales differently. Now, if you look back at zero-sum selling, the mindset of historic sales organizations, and I'm afraid there are still pockets of it around, is that every opportunity can be a sale. Because, if you can manipulate the prospect into buying from you, you can turn that into a sale. But you need the right sorts of techniques. So you need objection handling, you need closing techniques, you need influencing skills. And these are the sorts of things that sometimes still pervade sales training in the traditional sense. And sometimes consultants are exposed to this, and it's very off-putting. You don't need any of that if you're in the positive sum sales mode. All you need to do is establish whether there's a fit or not.
So I agree with you, by the way, it's worth saying, and I see the positive sum side of it, and day in, day out, I'm having these conversations for my own business. But sort of for someone who's thinking, they sort of buy what you're saying, what are those key differences? What does a positive sum conversation or sales conversation look like, in contrast to what you've painted for that sort of zero sum side?
So for the first thing you can say is that you can let go of this idea that you've got to bring some sort of dark art to the whole thing. So there is no mysterious black art. You don't have to worry whether you've brought certain techniques to bear or not. Have you run the meeting in the right way? I encourage people just to liberate themselves from all that. All you've got to do is establish a fit. or establish whether or not there is a fit. So that means having doesn't need to be a particularly structured conversation with somebody, but is there anything where this is what we do, this is what we do well, this is what we see in the industry, this is how we've helped out other clients. Delivering insights at this point can be very powerful, and very quickly getting to a mutual understanding of whether there is a potential fit between you or not. If there isn't, fine, then there can be a number of reasons why there isn't a fit, then you move on. But if there is a fit and there's a mutual benefit to working together, then that should be comfortably progressed to the next stage. There's nothing sleazy or pushy or manipulative about that. And it should be something that people feel culturally at ease with and be able to let go of some of the negativity and the fear that they've attached to it in the past.
I sort of know you gave the justification for it earlier, but that cultural element's quite an interesting one as well, isn't it? In that sort of us Brits, and it may be by virtue of all of the things you described earlier, but we just seem to have a greater aversion to sales than some other sort of nations. Particularly the easiest dichotomy to draw is the States, isn't it? Where in the States everyone's a salesman, and I've had guests on before talking about the challenges and benefits of that when you're moving from UK to the States and vice versa. In your experience, is it a particularly British thing? And if so, what are some of those elements that are unique to Brits? Is it the things you described earlier, or is there anything else that you find is it a mainly British challenge, or what is it that holds us Brits back?
So I mentioned Dan Pink's research for his book "To Sell Is Human," and it was really stunning how much negativity came from his US audience.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, and I've done this sort of work pretty much all over the place, including Southeast Asia. And, I'm amazed how similar people are. More often it's the similarities that strike me rather than the differences culturally.
And is it the similarities of the things you've highlighted? Or I'm intrigued, are there any other similarities that almost people wouldn't expect or jump out in terms of those challenges to not thinking they can sell, or not, actually at this stage, it's not wanting to sell?
Yeah. So other similarities pretty much pervade all sorts of cultures. Another example I would give is one of the other myths that I come across, particularly amongst consultants, which is that people have a vision or a premise around what constitutes a natural salesperson. And it's quite common for people to look at the founders of their consulting firm and say, well, they're natural salespeople. But what's actually happened is those people have often built their skills. Otherwise, they would have thrown it in and gone back to taking a salaried role somewhere. And when people think about what a natural salesperson is, they'll often assume that it's an extrovert, that successful salespeople are, backslapping, golf playing, sort of...
Wolf of Wall Street,
Wolf of Wall Street type folk. Yeah. And without necessarily doing a personality profile, most consultants that are quite analytical in nature think of themselves as being further towards the introversion end of the spectrum. And what's quite interesting is, as with so much of this work, there is pretty good science on it. Adam Grant, a well-known social psychologist, has done a great study with a sales team matching performance against where people sit on the introversion-extroversion curve. And he found that high extroverts perform as badly as high introverts, which seems counterintuitive at first, but what seems to be the case is very high extroverts turn out to be really bad at listening. And I've witnessed this in some of my work with industrial sales teams when I've gone on calls with highly extrovert salespeople who, turn up at the meeting, ask a question, and then talk over the prospect before they've even managed to get anything out. So, and I witnessed that a lot. So, introverts with good listening skills, with a measure of empathy, are much better placed to perform really well in the sales role and grow their skills in that area than they possibly think.
I want to come on to how people build that skills, but I think there's a really important piece in what you've just said, and actually it comes back to what you were saying before of ultimately consultants are problem solvers, because no one knows what management consulting is, and frankly, after however long I spent in the industry, I still couldn't give you a definition that you could, I always say the acid test is, can you explain it to like a 10-year-old, and I couldn't, but problem solving is the closest you'd get. And I think, what I'm hearing from you, and completely agree as well in my experience, is ultimately, selling should be nothing more, and this isn't just to belittle it, but nothing more than helping someone solve their problems. And to do that, like you say, you need to listen, you need to empathize, you need to build a solution. And then if that solution has a monetary value associated, that's a sale. You know, the difference between advice and a sale is just the money you exchange. But it sounds like that sort of, well, that's what I'm getting from your explanation in terms of helping people, is actually it's just that mindset shift from, I'm not putting on like a pinstripe suit here. It's just I'm doing what I do, but in a slightly different frame of reference. Would you agree with that?
I think that's right, and that's absolutely right. I mean, what we've described there might sound a little bit passive. There is a sort of proactive element to it, and I would describe that as being the output of some of the good research on what makes for high-performance selling in industrial context. I'm thinking here of the work that CEB, now part of Gartner, did for the Challenger sale, where they said that challengers are the highest performing salespeople. And what they said was that, challengers take control of the sale, they're assertive, they deliver business insights. So what I wouldn't want to do is give the impression that great selling amongst consultants is about asking what problems the prospective client might have and then crafting a solution. It's often a bit more proactive than that. And it doesn't have to be about the relationship. Sometimes some of the highest performing consultants that I've met have actually been quite rude, not in the sense of rude selling, being aggressive, but being very, very insightful to the point where it borders on being slightly rude. But that's something that is of value. Those conversations, those sales meetings can be of enormous value in themselves to the client.
Yeah, and it's funny, you'd have to ask my clients or maybe the ones that haven't hired us, they probably would say different. But I think, like you say, there's a fine balance, and I try, and for me personally, that's a big thing to focus on. But like you say, the thing I was going to highlight is actually the experience I've had is exactly that. Is it obviously depends on the client or the prospect, but people want you to tell them the truth and be upfront with them, because ultimately, if you are there to help them with a problem, or in the services context, part of your value is explaining what that problem is and where you see their problems, and actually then it's on them to select it. And the old cliche, isn't it? Some clients probably do want you to take their watch and tell them the time, but some want you to make them a new watch. And it's knowing the difference and like you say, being helpful, probably without being rude. But frankly, if it works, if it works for some people, skirting that line they should be them.
Yeah. So then I make the distinction between being, aggressive in selling, which takes us into zero-sum territory, or being assertive in the sales process. And they're rather different things. And the latter need not be a contradiction with positive sum selling.
So I really want to come onto that, because I think there's a really powerful thing around that difference. And actually, when you get into the, I guess I'd probably call it loosely, the sales journey, that, helping people understand the difference between being assertive and being rude. Because I think it's failure one in our industry is probably, can you sell? Failure two is then, are you being too polite about it and losing sales because of it? Just before we move on to that, I want to dig in a little bit to one of the points you mentioned around sales being a skill, because I think we've talked about one of those, or sort of really focused on one of the aspects about it being grubby, and I think that is a real hang up. And then the second one is, as you sort of alluded to, is frankly people who just say, oh, well, I'm not a born salesman. I wasn't that kid in the school playground who was selling sweets from the tuck shop. So how can I do this? Now, I guess, what is it you mentioned around the workshops that you've sort of run with clients, and you've worked with plenty of firms on this. Yeah. What are some of the challenges they have, and how do you help people almost overcome that and understand they can learn it?
Yeah. So part of this is letting people let go of the idea that salespeople are born, because they're made rather than born. And again, there's a wealth of positive psychology from and when I say positive psychology, it's a specific dimension of research that's sort of cornerstone of mental toughness. I'm thinking particularly of the work of Carol Dweck and the concept of a growth mindset, as distinct from a fixed mindset.
I was reading it over Christmas,
okay.
But please,
excellent.
For my listeners, please explain what it is.
So the growth mindset is the approach that says skills are made rather than innate, and that it's possible to acquire just about any skill you care to think of with the right level of application and with levels of practice, and by leaning into it and being quite determined about it. You can achieve a lot. If you have the mindset that I simply wasn't born that way, that will become self-fulfilling. So the skills that one needs for selling are much less to do with techniques and methodologies, and much more to do with the ability to persist and the ability to deal with some of the negativity that you'll encounter, particularly, the rejection that's an inevitable part of the sales cycle. So what I try and get people to think about is, what's my plan for building my sales skills? What are the components of something called deliberate practice, which was coined by Anders Ericsson, the Swedish scientist that's looked at high performers in a range of sports and other areas such as musicianship. And, if you take a deliberate practice approach to building your skills in anything, that means carving out time to do it. It means getting help from experts or mentors. It means getting a feedback loop and so forth. But it does take effort, and it does mean taking yourself outside your comfort zone, which can be quite fearful for people. But those that do sort of grasp the nettle do quickly find it becomes quite satisfying.
Completely agree with you on both of those points. I think the Carol Dweck growth mindset piece, funnily enough, it was something a former guest, Simon Dennis over at Gate One, highlighted as one of his top reads. And it's slightly shameful it's taken me this long to get to it, but I think it is really important. And actually, I think in a high performing world where people have come through, particularly academia, and I know that Carol Dweck makes this point of almost, if you focused your whole life on exams and passing things, actually moving to a growth mindset where failure is almost certain at some point, it can be quite a daunting thing. For people listening, this I think is going to be across the grades, but you tell me if it plays out differently at different grades, is for someone who's listened to this and thought, okay, actually I'm going to give this a go, how can they start small? So, a sports analogy doesn't hold here, but I'm going to butcher one for the sake of it, is, if they're saying, right, I want to go and run 100 meters, what can they do to start? They're not going to start in the Olympics, and they're not going to start at sort of, the local meet. What is the equivalent of just going running up and down the street for someone who wants to, start to build that sales skills in a low risk environment, if you like?
I don't think there's necessarily a low risk environment. The minute you embrace selling, you're exposing yourself to risk, and part of the process is becoming at ease with the failure, the negativity, the rejection, because it's definitely going to become a part of it. Maybe we'll come to how you cope with that. So I think I would suggest, the equivalent of something in sport, the small steps, the baby steps, would be the lowest hanging fruit, where stuff is warmest. So looking for further opportunities within existing clients, looking for your close relationships where people well would be open to an initial conversation. And I think it's quite natural to say to somebody that quite well, not necessarily within a client, but maybe someone within your network who could potentially be a client, and say to them, can we have a coffee? I'm feeling my way into this whole sales thing to advance my career, and I'd just love a informal chat with you that might take the shape of a sales conversation ultimately, but it would be useful for me just to have a sort of no pressure chat, exploring what you're doing and how we might be able to help. So I would start within the comfort zone before stepping outside it.
I think it's really good advice, Ian. And like you say, that so often people think you've got to start and therefore you've got to go after that, that new $1 million or £1 million account, or, the biggest firm in your industry. And actually, those baby steps that you highlight, I think is a really good way. I want to come on to, because you mentioned it, and I think it brings us really nicely into the mental toughness piece and that handling negativity. So I want to go there. By the way, I'm writing down all of the bits I've promised we'll go back to, because I have a terrible habit of jumping around. But I want to get your advice, and it might be one of the things you've already said, so this could be quick, but I'm really keen to dig into it. I know one of the things that helped me in my own selling is having a framework. So I completely agree with you that sort of, it's not a set of tools and, if you've got to sort of do a special hand signal and sort of say the magic words at the right time and all that. So it's not that. But I know personally it helped me having a structure or a philosophy or a framework. And I mean, you've mentioned things like the Challenger. So you've mentioned sort of Dan Pink and To Sell Is Human. But if it's one of those, let me know. But if not, if someone's listening to this thinking, right, I'm going to take your advice, I'm going to go have that coffee, is there a framework, either one you can describe or one that you can give me a URL or a book and I can link to, just something that would get someone started? So almost they've got the comfort of, at least they know the steps to go through in that conversation. Yeah.
So there isn't a single methodology out there that I would point to. What I would say is needed is a very simple outline process, maybe a 5-step process. And again, this is where something like having the right CRM is really, really helpful. So a 5-step process might be 1, making contact with somebody, 2, having a meeting, 3, having a proposal, 4, beginning negotiations and 5 agreeing to go ahead. And that clarity of process is so important. Where am I in the process? If I'm having a meeting with somebody, what's the outcome of that meeting? Generally, it's to move to the next stage of the process and to be clear that that's what you're trying to do. And if you aren't going to do that, then maybe you're going to qualify that opportunity out of your pipeline. And it's also quite useful to be upfront with your prospect about where we are in the process and what the objective of that meeting is. So very often when people get started with this whole sales thing, what you'll often find is they'll make contact with folk and go and meet them for a cup of coffee and then come back, and they're not quite sure what's happened or what's next. So just having clarity about that process and what the next steps are, and having your client or prospect being clear on that is, to me, 90% of the battle. You don't need any particular methodology. If you're doing zero-sum selling, you need methodology, you need techniques, you need to worry about acronyms and how to conduct the call. You don't really need that in a positive sum world. All you need to do is have clarity of where you are in the process and how you're moving an opportunity through those stages or qualifying it out.
I do want to touch on the process side because I think it's a really important bit. But I think just before we move off into the more structural elements of that sort of pipeline, that funnel creation, I do think it's probably a nice place to touch on the negativity side. Because I think, if we think about the consultant listening to this, they get why they should do it, they get what to do. And actually, I guess there's two sides to the sort of negativity and rejection. There's almost and I'd be interested to get your take on this. So I think there's people who get disenfranchised because it's almost death by a thousand cuts, in that they're not potentially brave enough to sell. So they have 50 coffees and get nothing, so they think they're no good at selling. Or there's the short, sharp rejection of, you have a meeting and someone says, no, I'm not interested. And that's usually the polite end of what they say. And whichever one, you see, or maybe both, or whichever one you see more of, I'd be interested how you sort of help people develop that, mental toughness, as you call it, to persevere and, get back on the horse, go for that next coffee and continue to do that repeatedly.
Yeah. It might be worth saying for a little bit about the science here, because what I'm constantly surprised by is that there is some fantastic science out there from positive psychology on what predicts success in selling, and nobody ever uses it. It's almost completely ignored. So what the science tells us is there are two attributes of personality, if you like, that predict success in selling. One is grit, something coined by Angela Lee Duckworth, that captures that ability to persist with passion towards our goals. And the other one has come from Martin Seligman, and it's called learned optimism. And optimism does not here reflect our idea that everything's going to turn out well. It talks about how we explain events to ourselves, the explanatory style. So if something doesn't go well, are we going to take that personally and say, well, that's me, it's just further proof that I'm no good at selling? Are we going to say to ourselves, it's always going to be like this, I'm never going to get any good at this? And are we going to say, think of it as pervasive? No one's buying, it's Brexit, whatever. So the best way of summarizing this is the 3 Ps, something made quite popular by Sheryl Sandberg in a Stanford address, which is very good at bringing this across. So the 3 Ps stand for personal, permanent, and pervasive. And so what I help people with is understanding the brain's natural self-protection mechanisms. When we're wired to shy away from things that have caused us social pain, and you don't get much more acute social pain than being rejected or ignored in the sales process. So the brain will be explaining what's happened, often in a very negative way. It's personal, it's permanent, it's pervasive. So you need to push back on that. So when I work with clients on building their resilience muscles, because they can indeed be built, the very first part of that is understanding the mental chatter that we all experience. And I say all, I mean, it never quite goes away. Even someone's experience as myself, when I get that chatter just the same as everyone else, because your negative brain wants to stop you from doing anything that's going to risk getting our genes into the next generation and surviving. So we're wired for the ancestral environment 100,000 years ago. So that's not particularly helpful in today's 21st century world. It was great when it was all about avoiding saber-toothed tigers and poisonous plants and so forth. So building those resilience muscles is very much about understanding the way the brain processes negativity and having the language to push back against some of those impulses, which will be to, the impulse will be to avoid putting yourself in that position again. And what happens when mental toughness isn't there, you'll often see a lot of avoidant behavior and displacement activity. And that's where the I'm too busy thing comes from. So the classic rationale for not having devoted or carved out time for selling is I'm too busy. I'm consumed with delivery. This client has asked me to do this. And it's rarely, in my experience, about time management, much more about mind management.
How do you help people overcome that? Because I completely agree with everything you've said. And I was reading something, one of these things that pops up on social media the other day of like a quote from, I can't remember who it was, but a world famous sports star saying basically exactly the same thing. And I think it's all about how you manage it, not that it disappears. And how, again, it might be that there are or there aren't, but where do you point people to, or how do you advise people to sort of overcome that? Is there any tools or techniques or tactics, either specifically related to sales or more just generally about building that sort of mental toughness and resilience that you help people with?
So again, it's about managing your explanatory style. So this is something that can feel a little bit complicated and does need a little bit of sort of work in depth, but you sometimes need to push back on the emotional part of your brain when you're hearing those sort of negative explanations. When you take it personally, or when you start to tell yourself that this is permanent and pervasive, you need the mechanisms to push back on that, challenge it straight away so that you're not inhibited from persisting. So a lot of this is about learning to deal with the emotional reactivity of the brain, understanding the language that you'll be hearing internally and being able to push back on that. And over time, and I do have tools that people use to, particularly if they've been bruised quite heavily by a negative experience, to kind of process that. So just by stepping through a worksheet, they can often push back on that negative emotional reactivity, and it leaves them better placed to sort of pick themselves up and bounce back, which is ultimately what resilience is.
And it's a shameless plug by me for your book, but is that, you mentioned around worksheets there, for instance. Is that something that you cover in your book? Is there a handout you give? I'm really keen if there's something that worked for the firms you work with, if there's a place we can point listeners to try that sort of thing. It'd be really useful.
So that's very much part of the book. So since you're kind enough to mention it, it's called Head Starts, Build a Resilient Mindset so you can achieve your goals. And I do include a worksheet that enables people to sort of process a negative experience, and it goes into some depth on this whole area of learned optimism.
Well, what I'll do, Ian, is I'll put, when we put the show notes out, I'll put a link in the show notes so that anyone who's listening to this right now, they go to the show notes on my website or in the podcast app itself, whichever one they're listening to, it'll be in there. Because no, I think it's the reason I highlight it is I think it's a really powerful part of, particularly, well, it's developing in any skill, isn't it? It's that growth mindset, but selling is almost the area where people feel it most acutely, because also I guess it comes to that vulnerability point as well. It's probably one of the only areas in life where you're putting yourself in someone else's hands and they're deciding as I'm sure some of people said to you, that they're deciding whether they want you or not, they're deciding your value. And that can be really, if you don't deal with that in the right way, it can be a real problem for people. So I think it's hugely important. I think that naturally brings us on to actually the pipeline piece, particularly around sort of almost building your own or managing your own pipeline. And if pipeline is not the right word or the word that you use, we can vary it. But I think the thing that you highlighted, and frankly, I see this all the time doing what I do now in terms of marketing, is step one in sales, you mentioned around developing a pipeline, is let's go for that coffee. And step two is actually then the follow-up. I think too often from consultants I know, if step one is not asking for the sale, step two is almost being too polite around that follow-up, and almost to avoid what you highlighted before of being too pushy. I think some people can sometimes be almost too far the other way and just take the view of, oh, well, if they've not messaged me, they're not interested. And I think, as I'm sure you will explain much better than I, ultimately people are busy, and actually if you don't stay front and center of mind, they can drop away. And so I'm interested to get your take on how much of a problem that is in consulting particularly, and how you advise people to get to a point where they understand that and can strike the right balance, so they're not bombarding people every day with, Ian, what are you doing? Ian, are you buying? Ian, are you buying? But they're not going the other way and saying, oh, Ian, I dropped you a message last year. Are you still looking for something?
Yeah. So interestingly, this isn't unique to consulting. It's true of sales in general. And you're absolutely right. Pipeline is the perfect word for it. It's a metaphor. So you visualize the hopper at the top that narrows down, and you do need to put lots of stuff in there, and you do need to follow up. So you've made the point, it's exactly right, that people are busy, people have the intention to follow up with you, and other stuff happens, and the email that you sent sort of drifts down their inbox out of the line of sight. So one of my favorite bits of social psychology describes something called the spotlight effect. And this is related to this idea of taking things personally. So I won't describe the experiment at length because it will take a little while to explain it, but I'll just leave a little teaser by saying that it involves Barry Manilow in some way.
You're going to have to send me a link to the experiment so that I and listeners can go and have a look at it, but go on, carry on.
But the spotlight effect describes the way in which we think we're standing under a spotlight. So we overestimate the extent to which other people are judging us by a factor of about 2. And by the way, being ignored is much worse for us than being rejected. Again, it's something that goes back to our ancestral environment where being ostracized by your social group, could lead to death. So we're very finely tuned to avoid putting ourselves in situations where we might be ignored and ostracized. But when we don't hear back from somebody, and it happens all the time, you'll have a great meeting, you've sent a proposal in, it's exactly, the time's right, and then it goes dead. Happens all the time. Happens to the best of us. So when you don't hear back, again, the emotional parts of your brain will take it personally. They've obviously decided for some reason that I'm rubbish, and so they're not replying. And so this doesn't mean that you need to doggedly hound somebody, hourly, but there is an appropriate level, and you have to find that point yourself. But there is an appropriate level for pushing back and saying, haven't heard from you, is this something you'd like to take forward? I'd say a couple of things about how to do this and how frequently. Firstly, I think at every stage of the sales process, if you're emphasizing the positive sumness, you always need to give the other party an opportunity to say, actually, this isn't right, or the timing's not right. And, so I always advise people to do that because it will quieten down that part of your brain that's getting worried about being too salesy in inverted commas. Okay. So that's one thing. The other thing is, if you persist while giving them an opportunity to come back and say, well, things have changed or it's not right, and come back in 6 months, what will happen is people will turn around and say, thank you for persisting. And that's when you've got it about right. And I've worked with, some people that have managed to develop the habit of following up properly. This is why I advocate a good CRM system, because if you develop a process which says, for example, I hadn't emailed that person for, 2 weeks. So you email them or you call them, and in your CRM, you make yourself a little diary reminder to do it again in 2 weeks' time. And then it becomes less draining emotionally. You're not thinking to yourself, why haven't they come back to me? You're just making it a natural part of the process. And the other thing that I think I tell people to do, which is quite helpful, I think, is to, when you're having a meeting with somebody and you've agreed that you're going to send them a proposal, and you've qualified it, of course, rigorously. The other thing to ask is, if I haven't heard from you, when would be a good time for me to get back in touch? So you kind of got permission to persist at that point. So it's a little thing, but I think it can be helpful for your own ability to persist, and it dampens down some of this sort of anxiety about, oh my God, am I bugging this person? What are they gonna think of me?
Yeah, and I think we'll come on to CRM and systems, because I think another challenge in our industry, albeit it's not universal, is almost because sales is not seen as a core part, CRMs aren't seen as a core part, and actually I think there's part of that concern comes from the fact that if you're not using a CRM, and we'll come on to, because we have a CRM ourselves, and many of our clients do, all of our clients do, I should say. But even if you don't have a CRM, if someone's listening to this and frankly, they just have Outlook, well, you can set a reminder. It's a bit more manual, but you can easily set a reminder in 2 weeks. And actually by removing that mental burden, you remove a lot of the stress. It's funny, the thing that one of the things that sticks with me is a Tim Ferriss quote. I feel that my quotes are a lot less well-informed than yours. Mine have very little academic gravitas behind them. But he made the point that don't blame on malice what you can blame on busyness. And I probably butchered the quote. But I think, like you say, people take a negative if, Ian's not sent me a message on that proposal. And I know we've had it that, there were clients of ours that it took 6 months. And frankly, in our industry, in consulting, 6 months is not uncommon in terms of a gestation period. And actually touching base every 2 weeks is not... Most people probably get 2,000 emails in that time. It's scary, but it's not unheard of to get. And so if you're sending someone one email a week, you're 1/2,000th of their inbox, you're not going to be a dent. But like you say, that spotlight effect, and I'm going to look up I'm intrigued to hear what Barry Manilow did or didn't do. But I think it's really important. And actually also, I guess it's implicit in what you're saying, but frankly, doing it is the other thing, which is where the CRM comes. Because I think it's very easy. And, I know I've been guilty of this in the past, is if you've got loads of stuff on, you just forget the prospect you messaged 2 weeks ago.
Quite. Yeah. So part of the discipline is about consistently following up and sticking to the process. And CRM won't do it for you, but it will definitely help you do it consistently. And it will take some of the ego depletion, the sort of forcing yourself to do something that you feel uncomfortable with. It feels much more emotionally neutral if you're just saying, well, okay, here's my CRM. Here are 10 activities I've got to do today. I'll just get on and do it. I've got to pick up the phone to so-and-so. Here's where we were last time. Okay, I've got to send a follow-up email. So you're almost taking the sort of motivational drive out of it and making it just quite mechanistic, which from an emotional point of view makes it easier to follow through with it. Yeah, I was going to say something else about pipeline as well, because as well as follow-up, there is, of course, the need to get lots of stuff in the top of the hopper. I don't know if you were going to come to that.
So it was you preempted me very nicely. So let's talk about it. And actually, so interestingly, and just to set context, and this will help me as much as anyone else, is so it's a core thing that we talk to our clients about from a marketing perspective. But I'm meeting with a group of consulting firms at the end of the week and was asking them for challenges. And one of them, their exact question was, how do you build that cold pipeline? So I'd be really interested in, like you say, it's one thing if you're just messaging your friends and your network, but how do you go about filling the hopper?
Yeah. So first of all, on the necessity of filling the hopper. So we're not in the zero-sum world where every opportunity can be turned into a sale. So if you're selling timeshare, you can physically keep people in the room until they bring their credit card out, and you can, so it's not...
Whatever happened to timeshare? Sorry, I told you we'd go off on tangent. Do they still exist? Because I remember that was where, I remember those from years gone by as the sort of archetypal, terrible product that people sold.
Well, it does in certain parts of the world. Oddly, it's British people doing it. I went on holiday with my wife to Mexico, to the Maya Riviera, as they call it, and I was intrigued when we were invited to a timeshare presentation just to see how they did it from a sales point of view. So I subjected us to what turned into about an hour and a half before physically getting up and saying, I am now leaving. I'm just geeking out. But what was quite interesting was whoever had conceived the whole process had clearly read Influenced by Robert Cialdini and used everything in that book, but done it in a dreadful way. So it kind of backfired. This is clearly a digression, but one I'm happy to go down. But I could see absolutely at every stage what they were doing. They gave us a little freebie. The guy was really pleasant. They got me to fill in a little survey saying, what I like to do, so they could play that back to me. So that I thought, oh gosh, it's obvious I need a timeshare apartment because I've said that I, like to do this. They had all these little techniques. Some of them were quite subtle. So we were being shown around an apartment and another couple were brought in. And when they'd left, our chap said they've already bought, but they wanted to see one of these ones. So social proof, tick the social proof box. It's interesting. It doesn't work. It doesn't really work.
I think the interesting thing about the book you mentioned, so Robert Cialdini Influence, I think is what is in there. And I think what you were explaining is, if you take it to the extreme, is what you see or what you saw in that timeshare event. And actually after this, I'll tell you all about a property event I went to, which was exactly the same. And I actually, in a weird way, I would kind of recommend people go to these. A bit like when you teach a child to do something, you teach them like the extreme end.
Yeah.
But actually, it shows you how these things work and the visceral feeling it has on you. I always just, and we'll come back to Cialdini in a second, but I always remember, so I went to this property event, and you'll like this, is they had a technique, so they'd done all the scarcity stuff, and the social proof was actually, they basically got, if you imagine the audience is 100 people, they got everyone who wanted to buy the thing up on stage. And now most people just wanted to be on stage with the speaker. So you ended up with 80% of the audience on stage. And I was sort of sitting in the front or second row. And I just remember, I knew what they were doing, but the feeling of 80 people standing on a stage going, why aren't you buying this? It's amazing to behold. It's interesting because I think, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree, and I'm open to either, but I think that book specifically, while I agree with you in the sort of zero sum versus positive sum piece, there's a lot of interesting aspects in that do play into our buying decisions that I think actually are quite important at the right volume, if you like. So, social proof, for instance, is massive when selling anything, because actually your clients need to know you can do it. And others have bought from you. But I completely agree with you that going to, and your wife must love you if you took her to a timeshare presentation on holiday, I hasten to add. But actually it's, I guess with those sort of elements, it's about getting the right balance for your context, your client and your sale, and not, like you say, almost overplaying your hand. And some of those things also are only going to work in a sort of B2C space. So I'd love to think of you bringing another client in and saying, oh, we're too busy to work with you. But people, these things happen. But sorry, that was a digression on a digression.
Yeah. So because we're not in a zero-sum world, we're going to have lots of people where there isn't a fit. So the timing's not right. We haven't got any budget. We've just had a major reorganization. What you have is perfect for them, but maybe at another time. So for that reason, you absolutely need to put a lot, and people almost universally don't put enough in at the top of the pipeline. And as you say, people find that a challenge. And you mentioned the word cold. So when people talk about cold, they think of cold calling. And again, there's an image here of being given a phone directory and having to sit by the phone and ring people up and work through it. So I've got two things to say to that. The first thing is there's much more warm stuff around than you probably think. So what I take people through is a structured pipeline development tool, which says, let's start with the warm stuff before we have to worry about going through the yellow pages or whatever. And often, okay, let's go through your existing clients. Have you exhaustively pursued all the new opportunities within your existing clients? And there's almost always more that one can do. What about people that you haven't worked with for a while? When did you last ring the client that you'd worked with a year ago or 18 months ago? Have you systematically got something that says, I'm going to give that person a call or go and meet them? Again, some people do that rigorously, but often people don't. Something that I find really interesting is how rarely people go to a client and ask them, who else should I be talking to? I mean, it's a really fundamental thing, but people are happy to do it. If you've done great work for somebody, that's a very natural thing for them to say, that they want to evangelize what you've done. And they're often really happy to give you fantastic introductions, but, they may think of it themselves and say, oh, I want to introduce you to X, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with asking. So people rarely do that. I mean, one thing this is what I'm about to say is not an invitation, but I am amazed at how rarely clients contact me and say, I see you're connected to so-and-so on LinkedIn. Is it someone you knew well? Could you introduce? It's happened with industrial sales clients. So people, very high-performing senior salespeople whose companies pay me money. So it's a perfectly legitimate thing to say to me, can you introduce me to so-and-so? They're in a company we want to work with. Do you know them well? Is it appropriate to introduce them? It almost never happens with people from the consulting world. And I've got a pretty extensive network. I've got senior people in different industries. Again, not an advert, but I'm just making the point.
Yeah, well, I might take you up on that afterwards, but we'll hold that till the end.
Yeah. So the summary there is there's much, much warmer stuff than people generally think. So if you take a really structured approach to your network, for example, so just let's go through your LinkedIn connections. Who's moved jobs that you didn't notice this, but 6 months ago, someone you're connected to moved jobs, that might be an opportunity. There's so much warm stuff there before you have to start thinking about cold. Right. So then I talk about cold calling, which has a terror for people, quite unnecessarily, because again, there's a fixed mindset often that cold calling doesn't work. And I have to say, from personal experience, done in the right way, it does. And again, this is about attitude and mindset. So when I work with high-performing consultants that sell well, they want new logos. They think of companies that they're not currently working with, and they say, we should be working with that firm. There's almost a sense of entitlement. They can see the fit. And so they say, who do we know? How can we get an introduction to so-and-so? Does anybody, they're constantly looking for ways in. It doesn't have to be zero sum. It doesn't have to be sleazy. You're just looking for some form of entree. And sometimes that might mean dropping an email to somebody that you've never met and saying, we haven't spoken before. I thought I'd get in touch because it strikes me that what we do could be very relevant to you. Here are some examples. Here are some case studies, blah, blah, blah. I do that. And I get work through doing that.
So on the warm selling side, because I think something you've struck on there is actually part of the terminology, and it was me who used it, so it was my fault. But I think a lot of people in our industry use similar of almost the difference between a warm and cold lead, in that most people think of a warm lead as someone who's shaken a hand and said, yeah, let's do business or let's have a meeting. And I think the thing you're highlighting, and it's really important. And frankly, one of our longest standing clients has come exactly from the approach you said of, I messaged a number of people I knew who knew me, knew what we were doing, and said, well, do you know anyone who, knowing me, knowing them, knowing what we do, might want to have a conversation and might need us? And I think it's one of those things that sounds obvious when you say it, but consulting firms and consultants focus so much on delivering a great outcome. I don't know a successful consulting firm that isn't built on great work and great clients, like you say, that positive sum, great value adding project. But then if you've got these evangelists in these businesses, why wouldn't they recommend you to other people in their network? And it's, I guess, that 5 degrees of separation, isn't it? Of you don't know who they know. And if you don't ask the question, you don't know. But it's redefining what a warm lead is, isn't it? From I know you because we've met through to I might know you or you might know someone. So I'll get in touch.
Yeah. So I use warm to mean anything that is not total, cold, unsolicited, no relationship of any kind. And there's, as I say, there's varying degrees of warmth, but so I use it probably to mean something a little cooler than many people have in mind.
I think it's that spectrum that most people forget of. There's more out in the world than just completely cold and sort of, I guess, quite warm going on hot. And I guess the other side of the cold thing is you sort of mentioned in the example that you were saying, because I agree as well, it works, is a lot of it depends on what you are going out to someone with. And I think, again, a bit like sort of the modern day equivalent of sort of that encyclopedia selling and consultants, my listeners will have it all the time, is you get that recruiter who's never looked at your profile, who says, we should speak because I've got some jobs you might be interested in. And hey, it must work. It's why estate agents letterbomb people. But that gets a negative reaction because it's all about a zero sum. What am I taking from you? But like you've highlighted, you can't know where every potential client is in their journey, when they might need you. And actually, if you share something of value, we do it from an inbound perspective. We put out targeted PPC and help our clients do it and drive inbound. But it's the same thing is, we're driving cold inbound. You can do exactly the same thing cold outbound, but it's about what you're giving to get that, isn't it? Would be my take. Yeah. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So sometimes a give helps. I mean, I would say in whatever you're sending to somebody, if it's an email or any other form of communication, emphasizing the positive sumness of the potential relationship is what it's all about for me. So that will be less off-putting than I would like to sell you something. Although some people are just going to, bat away whatever you send them, but you have to live with that. But the more you can bring that positive sumness to life, the more likely it is that somebody's going to engage.
So you triggered a point that I noted down and meant to add to what you said or sort of get your take on, because I think you highlighted it, but I really wanted to drive it home because it's something that, it comes out in what you're saying about this positive sum piece of there is a cycle, if you like, to a lead or frankly, let's call them what they're, the people and where they are in their journey in terms of buying you. And actually, I think too often people will forget about someone because they spoke to them a year ago and they didn't need a digital system transformation or they didn't need an operating model or whatever it might be. And so you actually people discount them. It's almost, they sort of tick them off their list. So I had 100 leads, I've now got 99. Whereas I think what you're saying is actually that hopper is, it's a recycling of, just because you spoke to someone a year ago, they may have moved firms, they may have moved roles, they may have just frankly had a difficult year or change. That in itself can help you build that pipeline of cold or sort of lukewarm leads as well.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
It'd be good now to almost turn to some of the things you've talked about around process, because I think we've covered some really great ground for individuals in terms of just that mindset and that specific bits around how can I fill my hopper, how can I manage that hopper. Maybe we start with CRM and you sort of move from there. But I think, what are some of these systems or processes that consultants, be it individuals if they're listening to this, or if it's because so listeners to the podcast range from analysts to sort of managing partner level. So whether it's a different answer or not, for if I'm a junior trying to set this up on my own versus a managing partner who's trying to build this out for my firm, what are some of those systems or processes that really need to be put in place to underpin that successful sales culture?
I often come across particularly smaller consulting firms that run everything on spreadsheets, and also independent consultants will often do the same thing. So I think there is no lower limit for when it makes sense to use CRM. Even if it's for an independent operator, one seat on a good CRM system is invaluable, because it brings with it the structure. You've got the mechanism there to have a 5 or 6 or 7 stage process. They're all malleable. And if you get one that presents the pipeline graphically to you on the screen, as some do, I think there's almost a neurological benefit to you when you move something through the pipeline. You get a little bit of a dopamine squirt.
I can agree to that firsthand. There's nothing more exciting than moving something from prospect to proposal to sold.
Exactly. And I think developing the virtuous habits of setting up your activities, moving stuff through the pipeline, qualifying stuff out, that makes the whole sales process habitual. And again, I mentioned ego depletion, this idea that it becomes sort of, it can become demoralizing when things don't go well. You can easily become deflated. The more you make it a process, it becomes emotionally neutral. And that's why having the right CRM system is particularly helpful. I can recommend a particular one. I don't know if you want to endorse. I'm not paid by this supplier, but
I'm always interested. I have my own views and thoughts on. So we just as we use Agile. We have clients on Pipedrive, but I'm intrigued. What's the one you'd recommend?
Well, you've just named it, Pipedrive. That's the one I use, and I recommend that to other people. I'm not paid by them, but I think, and it's continually got better. They've introduced new features to it that make it much richer, and it integrates really neatly with other things as well. So, I should get a commission for that, I think. But
you should, if you've got a referral code or something. I'm happy to put it in the show notes. But no, we do say one particular client of ours uses Pipedrive, and it's brilliant. Only reason we use Agile is just that's where I started when we started, and actually. It does. So why I use it is exactly what you've said, and what I know Pipedrive does, I think probably better, is it's that visualization. It's that deal track, reporting. I mean, Pipedrive's what, 10? I mean, you tell me. You pay for it. It's something like 10 quid a month, isn't it? It's
not
pennies
expensive
in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. So I pay for the platinum version annually, so I can't remember what that is. But you can get a 3-month trial of it free. And I would advocate that anybody that's currently flying a spreadsheet should migrate stuff over to that. It's hugely beneficial. So that's a big part of the process. And in fact, having that disciplines you into identifying what the steps of your process are. So that's one of the outputs of using CRM properly, is you get to do that.
The emotional thing's interesting as well. I'm intrigued on your take or what your clients think, because I think the other thing that I think the CRM can really help with, especially that graphical element, is let's say you've got 20 conversations in train, you can see them. And so if one goes badly, well, actually, you don't take as much of an emotional hit because your sort of fight or flight response can't kick in because you can see the 20. Whereas if you've not got that, you forget about those and think the world's going to cave in because you've only got the one. And I mean, I've personally found that helpful. And I don't know if that's something that you find with your sort of clients, that's a draw as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's if it rewards you for structuring and maintaining a healthy pipeline. Absolutely right.
And by the sounds of it, and from what you're saying, it almost, whether you are an individual consultant or a firm, the things you're talking about and the CRMs you're talking about, you can set up yourself. If you're a partner in a firm or a director wanting to make partner, or even you've just come into a firm, like you said, Pipedrive's free for 3 months, and I'll have to check after this, but I don't think the basic subscription is going to be cost the earth. Actually setting this up yourself will give you a good starting point.
Yeah, I would agree. That's absolutely right. The other thing I would say is for junior people in consulting firms that are just starting out, asking to get a seat on the CRM, which might typically be withheld for people at a certain level of seniority, or people that are, already quite advanced in sales or business development. Part of leaning into this and building your growth mindset is saying, I want a seat on the CRM so I can start putting opportunities in there. Put your hand up and ask for it.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one. I'd be intrigued if you find this with clients you've worked with, because I think one of the challenges that some firms can face is actually, because CRMs can do so much, and like you say, and I'm sure in the industrial side they're used a lot more frequently and for a lot more. But actually, I've seen instances where almost because there's so much they can do, people try and do it all and almost get disenfranchised with the CRM, because you need to do meeting notes, you need to do opportunities, you need to do funnel management. And almost if someone was just putting a CRM into their firm, or like you say, sort of trying to start out, if they could only do one thing with a CRM, what is that key thing that would add that value and just keep it super simple for them?
If I come at a sort of reverse into that answer, often the motivation for putting a CRM in is activity management, forecasting, not helping people sell better. So if you've started with that in mind and you get into the sort of star chamber, in industrial companies, it can almost become surveillance. If you get into that mindset, then you've come at it from the wrong direction. So if you're putting a CRM in to help people get better at selling, then it needs to be just very simple, bottom-up process, and the reporting should just drop out of that naturally without being something that individuals are troubled with.
Yeah, and it's a really powerful point, and thank you for reversing into it, because that why is so critical. Is it a sales enablement tool, or is it a reporting? And like you say, in some industries, it does become a surveillance tool. I guess, is there any other, just thinking about it, any other of those sort of firm-wide pieces of infrastructure or processes or systems that anyone listening to this who wants to implement a sales culture in their organization should be thinking of, or is that CRM the sort of main one?
So there's probably two other key things. One is what sort of sales meetings you have. So are your sales meetings star chambers? Where are we with this? What's happened to this proposal that's been drifting? Or are they meetings that are supportive, that are where people put their hand up and say, I could use some help with this opportunity? So having the right sort of structured meeting that is not about forecasting and about the where are we on X is really important. Okay, so that's it's hard to do if there's pressure, but with the right structure and with the right mindset, it's possible to have something that helps everybody grow and work collaboratively. Something aligned with that. Some of the clients I've worked with have found this very helpful. Is and I've facilitated this for them. Is some sort of charter, like a sales charter. How do we want to be around the sales part of our role? And they will talk about that we're all in sales, that we're committed to carving time out, that we will support one another, etc., etc. So having some sort of shared ethos and values around the sales part is really helpful as well as part of the infrastructure. The other thing that I would say, and I heard in your podcast with Rob Garner, I heard him mention this a couple of times, and I kind of silently applauded, was qualification. So often it's either done poorly or not done at all, which means that people can often spend inordinate amounts of time, for example, writing proposals that are never going to lead to anything. And that can become a form of displacement activity in itself. So I advocate a really simple approach, and a 4-letter acronym, BANT, B-A-N-T, is as good as anything else. B stands for budget. Have you got budget for this? A stands for authority, so who actually signs off on it? N for need. Is this something that for which there is a clearly stated need? And timing. Is this something that they want to move quickly on, or is it something that we come back to in a year? So those 4 letters, B-A-N-T, can form the basis of a sort of very simple qualification tick box exercise. And if you can't answer those questions, then you don't move it to the next stage in the CRM. It doesn't become a qualified opportunity. And having that discipline at that very, very important stage is probably, one of those 2 or 3 things that I've mentioned that make a big contribution to your overall process and infrastructure.
Yeah, and I like the point around the meetings. And I think, again, I'm guessing this, but you'll know better than me. And I think if I think about consulting firms, I know a lot of firms that have had pipeline management meetings where it's very much, looking at those metrics. But actually, I really like what you were sort of saying. Well, actually, is there a sales meeting, almost a support meeting where it's, who could we go out to, I guess, brainstorming, and I think too often consulting firms sort of forget that and just actually spending an hour a week or an hour every 2 weeks saying, well, who do we know? Who can you help me connect with? Who can I help connect with? It's something that I think many firms would be, hugely benefit from. And like you say, that BANT acronym, again, just having a framework around it. I'm getting the sense that it's keeping this stuff simple and just putting in the structures that matter, that help your clients be successful.
Absolutely right. I mean, it's so much better to do something small and well rather than take on something overarching and complex. I think because sales is a bit of a black art, or perceived as a black art, people feel the need for some sort of complex external process / methodology that we have to sort of, sheep dip everybody through. And it simply isn't necessary and rarely efficacious. Just simple and small is best.
I think that's a really nice place almost to round off today. And I think that simplicity point, it's hit me loud and clear, and hopefully those listening as well, of just, what you said there. It's better to do a few simple things well than try and overcomplicate and over-engineer. And I think as consultants, we can be guilty of over-engineering and developing very slick processes that potentially, when something's simple, maybe just like you say, pipe drive and a simple meeting with the terms of reference would do the job. So I want to bring us almost to the last couple of questions. And given everything you've said during our conversation, I think you might have quite a lot of answers to these. So I'm really looking forward to them. And it sounds like, given what you just mentioned about, you listened to the interview with Rob, who was a great guest, by the way. So I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
And other conversations of mine, you'll probably know what's coming here. But so these are questions I ask all of my guests. And the first one is on books. And so you've hit on a whole host. And so don't be constrained in this question. I constrain it to guide people, but the question is very much around what books you find yourself giving or recommending most often. And please, don't take that to 1 or 2. If there's 10, tell me. But if there's that 1 or 2 that have really impacted you, or that you find yourself giving away, obviously including your own, it would be great to hear what your recommendations are.
Yeah. So the literal answer to that question is my own book, because I have a couple of boxes of them and I do give them away. So so Head Start by me is the one I give away most. But there are others that I recommend a lot, particularly with sales as a context. I've mentioned a couple already. Dan Pink, who's a terrific writer, and though he's not a scientist, he's very good at making the science very accessible. So To Sell is Human is a fantastic book about sales, and he does talk about the 3 Ps and learned optimism. I also like, in a similar vein, Philip Delves Broughton, Life's a Pitch. We've mentioned The Challenger Sale, which is by Brent Adamson. I think it's not about consulting sales, but I think consultants will be very reassured by the data from that. If I had to pick another one, it would be Learned Optimism by Martin Seligman. And that talks about some of his work that he did with Peter Schulman in Metropolitan Life, the US's biggest insurer, where he did some really interesting studies on new recruits and their level of explanatory style and how that predicted success for them. So that's my final recommendation.
Brilliant. Well, some great recommendations in there. And I think from the few, I think probably only one of those I've read, a brilliant book, exactly like you say, for consultants. And the other one, so I've been trying to, because for listeners, we're doing this over Skype, I've been trying to dig out the Positive Psychologist that I read, because it's not on selling, but it is a brilliant field. I will remember it after this interview. And sadly, I won't put it back in like a bad 1990s computer game. But I think, like you said, I think as a field, it's fantastic. And you mentioned around Carol Dweck and the growth mindset, and just those sort of books that help people understand their potential and come at things from that positive perspective are fantastic. So thank you for those. And I'll include links to all of those, including your own, in the show notes, so that anyone who's listening can go and find them. And then the last question, and again, one that you'll probably know is coming, is your advice. And so this is a recap. And you know, if it's the sales piece you want to major on, as we've talked about today, brilliant. If there's other broader pieces from some of that other sort of mental toughness side you mentioned around, you do it for sort of others as well. If there's anything from there, please throw that in. And this question is very simply, you've got three people in front of you. You can give one piece of advice to each. Those three people are somebody who is just starting their career in consulting, so say graduate, someone who is in the middle, so I'm going to say manager level. If you listen to Rob, you'll know I explained this then, but I'm trying to move away from age ranges because I'm usually wrong with them. And then the third is for the group who are approaching partner, so your director, if you like, in a sort of traditional consulting structure. And as I say, the question is, what one piece of advice would you give to each of them?
There's something that I'd probably say to all of them, which is that think of sales as something that can be very satisfying and actually enjoyable rather than something that's fearful. So I talk about leaning in and embracing sales. And ultimately, there's nothing more motivating than mastery, feeling that you're getting better at something. And you'll know this, you know, when you do sell, it's actually very, very satisfying intrinsically. So my first advice would be to everybody would lean in, do it more, make it part of what you do. So for the first category, for the first person, I would say at that stage of their career, focus on building their network. That's going to be very valuable to them as they become more senior. So that means networking, going to conferences, keeping in touch with people that they've known in the past and sustaining relationships. I think for the second category, it becomes much more about being engaged in the sales process, where it might not necessarily touch them day to day. So they might be working on a client, maybe speaking to the partner or whoever the respective person or the engagement director, whatever the title is, and just getting engaged with what's the next step for this client. Maybe there are things that I hear when I'm working with that client that are useful for that partner to know about. Maybe there's potential opportunities. It's at this stage, it's partly about listening. But also, that might be the point at which you start to put your hand up and express an interest in building your skills in selling. So you might be asking for a mentor. You might be expressing your curiosity about the sales process and how you can become more involved. I also think it helps, and this is probably something you would advocate, to get some content out, to get a reputation for being an expert. So putting stuff out there, not because that will bring sales opportunities, though it will. It's much more about having something to talk to people about and building your reputation. For that third category, I think when you're at that level, you know, you're almost being required to fulfill the rainmaker role. And this is where it's about new logos, I think. That's where the most excitement comes, that's where the kudos comes. So at this point, I would be saying, you know, look, carve out time in a very targeted way to establishing new relationships, extending your network, finding opportunities outside the existing client base to bring in. And that's I think the most impactful thing you can do at that level.
Brilliant. Well, some really good advice there, Ian. And yes, we probably remiss of me. We didn't touch on the marketing side, but I think you're spot on actually. And I guess it feeds into what you were saying. You've said throughout around positive sum is actually, I think it's positive sum at every step of the sales process. And so, you know, like you highlight, my view and what we share with clients is ultimately you need a reason to speak to someone. There has to be a positive sum from an interaction. And so even if it is a cold, you know, we talked about cold leads earlier or cold introductions, is if you are just meeting someone for a sale, that for me is a zero sum conversation. You know, you're saying, Ian, what can you buy from me? So you need something to talk about to make that positive sum, because even if you leave someone with a case study of how a competitor's done it or a different perspective on what they could do, you know, that's a positive sum interaction that's going to stand you in good stead. So yeah, I completely agree with you, and some really, really good advice there. So thank you for that. So the last thing then today, and this has been brilliant. Again, as I said in the introduction, I was really looking forward to this because it's a topic that I've wanted to cover properly on the show for the 2 years I've been running it. So thank you for giving me that opportunity. And for anyone who wants to find out more about yourself, wants to find out more about your book or your business, where would you point them to? Where can they get in touch?
So if they Google Ian Price Recludo Consulting, they'll find my website, recludoconsulting.com. On LinkedIn, of course, happy to take connections. So either route is a good one to make contact with me.
Fantastic. Well, I will put both of those in the show notes as well as the link to your book so people can find that as well. So all that's left to say is thank you very much. It's been great and all the best for the rest of your week.
Yeah, well, thank you, Nick. I've enjoyed it. Great. Cheers.
Thanks a lot. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Climb in Consulting podcast. If you did, I would be very grateful if you could leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcast platform of choice, whichever one you may be using. And please also share this with anyone that you think could benefit from hearing today's interview. If you want to get in touch or give me any feedback about the podcast, please feel free to drop me an email. It's nick@climbinconsulting.com, and I look forward to hearing from you.